Well, thanks for the opportunity to come visit with you tonight. Really appreciate it. At the Iowa Department of Transportation, we have a long history of working with staff at the University of Iowa and hiring a lot of University of Iowa students. And that assistance and the employees have been extremely valuable and critical to our work. So we continue to use that expertise to this day. Professor Fuller provided a great overview at the national level of the daunting challenges we're facing in transportation. I'd like to bring that a little bit to the Iowa level, primarily focusing on the highway side and public transit side, and then close with some discussion about some emerging issues regarding funding uncertainty, again, what Professor Fuller closed with and touched a little bit about at the national level. Some discussion about climate change and also some passenger rail service, particularly since a lot of our initiatives are focused on trying to get some passenger rail service here to Iowa City in the not too distant future. To begin with, I thought it would be helpful to frame the transportation system in the state of Iowa. We actually are blessed with a rather extensive transportation network, a multimodal transportation network. We have over 114,000 miles of public roadways in the state of Iowa. We have approximately 4,000 miles of railroad. That actually is down from a high of about 10,000 miles in the early 20th century, but still a pretty extensive system. 111 public airports, 8 of which provide commercial service to Iowans. 35 public transit agencies that cover every county in the state. Almost 1,500 miles of trail facilities, bicycle pedestrian facilities, and then 2 rivers that border the state, Missouri River, Mississippi River, that provide navigation and water transportation, mostly on the Mississippi side, not so much on the Missouri side in recent years. Focusing on the highway system, as I said, we're blessed. It also comes with some challenges having an extensive infrastructure system. We have 114,000 miles, as I said. Basically, that system is a mile grid system in the state. And that's a system that was critical to get farm products to the market, provide that land access. And that system still is critical today to provide that access. So that 114,000 miles of public roads are owned by public jurisdictions in the state. The state system, the state jurisdiction system that's owned and operated by the state of Iowa through the Iowa Department of Transportation is about a 10,000 mile system. And that's the interstate highways that you see, the US and Iowa numbered routes. The county road system is a 90,000 mile system. It's owned and operated by Iowa's 99 counties. And that's shown in yellow here. You can see the relative share in the left chart, or left bar, of mileage. So obviously the county road system has the largest share of miles in the state. And then the third piece is those public roads owned and operated by Iowa's 947 cities. That's about 14,000 miles in the light blue up there. So a lot of infrastructure owned by a lot of jurisdictions in the state. It's also useful to look at this in terms of how the travel is distributed in the state. We use the acronym VMT for vehicle miles of travel to measure how much travels on the system. It really is just a summation of all the miles traveled on each system. While the DOT owns less than 10% of the miles of system, we carry about 61% of all the travel in Iowa on our state roads. And then if you look at just the traffic of the large trucks, the semi-trucks on the system, we're getting close to 85% of all the large truck travel in the state is on the DOT-owned system. So we do have a lot of highway infrastructure in the state. I should mention it's not just highways, it's also bridges. We have 25,000 bridges in the state of Iowa. As I said, it's a little bit of a curse as well having all this infrastructure, because while we have the 5th highest number of structures in the country and 13th most miles of roads, we're 30th in population and 23rd in land area. So we have a heavy infrastructure burden on a per capita basis, per square mile basis, however you want to measure it, that we have to maintain. Funding for highways. Of course, we have federal funding that comes into the state through regular federal aid. That's about $350 million a year. You'll see the Recovery Act bullet underneath there. I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a couple minutes. That was the one-time stimulus funding that came into the state of Iowa for highways. You'll see it's $358 million, so it basically doubled the federal aid we had for highway transportation. So really significant one-time infusion of money, but again, one-time being the key part of that. At the state level, that's where the bulk of funding comes for roadway infrastructure in the state. We have the Road Use Tax Fund, which is our trust fund at the state level, which is a little over $1 billion in revenue, primarily from a state fuel tax rate, but also vehicle registration fees, both that we pay annually and that we pay when we purchase a new vehicle. That forms the bulk of the state road use tax fund revenues. Time 21, that's something I'll talk about here in a minute. It's a new fund of money that was generated here in recent years in order to try to meet some of the critical needs we're facing in the state. That provides about $60 million, and that's continually growing. And then iJobs. iJobs was our state of Iowa response to the economic downturn, and that was the state stimulus funding, which provided a pretty significant infusion of funding for transportation as well. 95 million of which went into highways for bridge repair and replacement across the state, and also regular maintenance for city and county roads. And then for the roads owned by cities and counties, they also, of course, have local revenues, primarily through property tax, and in some cases, local option sales tax that communities have passed and dedicated to transportation. We like to talk about the highway funding issue as a perfect storm. And this is a perfect storm that's been building for probably 15 years now. When we first started talking about in the mid-90s about the need to start addressing tremendous funding shortfall that's coming up in the future, and that's where we're at now. That perfect storm, we assigned 4 components to it. First, as I just talked about, we have a large and aging system of infrastructure in the state of Iowa that has resulted in tremendous growth and needs to maintain and rehabilitate the system. At the same time, in the 80s and 90s, tremendous growth in travel on the system. Travel, both of passenger cars, but semi-trucks, that were stressing pavement damage and bridge damage, and also resulting in capacity needs. Interstate 80 is probably a good example that you're all familiar with. The growth on Interstate 80 is causing us to look at several billions of dollars worth of needs in the next 10 to 20 to 30 years, depending on what happens with our economy and whether that traffic growth starts continuing again. So tremendous needs out there due to increasing demand. On the financial side, revenues were flattening at the same time. We had a lot of built-in growth into our revenue streams in the 90s. That stopped at that point. And then as Professor Hanley probably started talking about when he visits with you, we have more fuel-efficient cars. We're starting to see alternative fueled cars that all have a major impact on the primary source of revenue, both at the federal and state level, which is fuel tax revenue. And then what we also have been experiencing at the same time was a hyperinflation of construction costs. And this really was the final nail in the coffin, is just a huge exponential growth almost for at least a few years in construction cost inflation on the highway side. It's a petroleum-heavy industry, and with asphalt being petroleum-based, and then grading equipment, highway construction equipment, of course, being operated on petroleum-based fuels, just had a really large growth in costs. So all those combined really caused a serious concern in highway funding revenues. So again, we started seeing this in the mid-90s. We took some steps to address the crisis, began immediately by trying to become more efficient, making sure we're maximizing the use of the funding we're provided, and then began studying needs and revenues, and then finally requesting and securing legislative action in Iowa. I'll go through the next couple slides pretty quick. This is just a little bit more detail about the actions we took. In the early 90s, we started with what we call the Road Use Tax Fund Committee. This was an effort initiated by leaders at the state, county, and city level on their own to proactively try to address the situation by becoming more efficient. So they met for a couple years and developed some recommendations that the legislature fully adopted to, again, maximize the use of funding. Some miles of state highways were transferred to cities and counties as a result of that, because it was felt they'd be more efficiently maintained at that level. For very small cities in Iowa, some of their roads were transferred to the county because it was felt the county could more appropriately maintain those roads. And then lastly, in an effort to try to address with the fact that we have a lot of infrastructure in the state, reduce the process to lower maintenance standards on the very low volume county road system. So make it easier for counties to reduce maintenance standards on those very low roads to reduce their expenses on them. So those were all, as I said, all implemented and provided a lot of assistance in delaying when we needed to come back and start talking about money. So, as I said, that delayed that a few years, but then became pretty clear something was going to have to be done. Actually, at this point, the legislature weighed in and directed the Iowa Department of Transportation to undertake a study to look at needs and revenues to maintain Iowa's public road system over the next 20 years. And so undertook a cooperative effort with cities and counties, identified, as you would expect, a huge shortfall in funding, actually a $27.7 billion shortfall in funding to meet all the needs that exist in Iowa over the next 20 years. So that's $1.4 billion a year in additional revenues, basically a doubling of revenue to meet all needs. Now, we knew that we weren't going to have any success and probably would be laughed out of the room if we went and tried to double the gas tax and vehicle registration fees and all the user fees that exist right now in the state. So we went to the next step to identify what are the critical needs that we face in Iowa at the city, county, and state system to support the economy. So we pared down that volume of critical funding needs to get to the point where we identified that we needed $200 million a year to meet that critical needs that exist. One point about that $200 million, if we had been successful in getting that $200 million, the average condition of the public roads in Iowa still would continue to decrease. It wasn't enough to reverse that trend on the overall network, but at least would allow, again, this critical infrastructure to be maintained and even improved in some cases. So we did make some recommendations. Of course, the big one is creating $200 million of new money each year. And we requested that it be put in this new fund, the Time 21 fund that I showed earlier. Because since these are needs for the critical infrastructure, we felt the funding needed to be distributed differently than existing road funds, and it needed to be targeted on that critical infrastructure. So we made those recommendations as a result of that report. And then the legislature passed some language, which Governor Culver signed in May of 2007, which didn't create a funding stream, but it created all of the mechanisms for administering that funding, which may not sound much at first blush, but actually these are very challenging issues when you're talking about how to distribute money, how to target it. So it was a huge step in 2007 when the legislature passed this bill to distribute this money and identify how it should be targeted. Recognizing that they hadn't fully taken all the steps they need to take, they did direct us to do another study to identify some more information to help them look at funding mechanisms. So we did that study. Of course, it took some time. In the meantime, we continued to have hyperinflation of construction costs, and the funding hadn't been created, so there was a delay. So we actually reassessed our funding need and decided that through that analysis, that now instead of $200 million a year, we needed $267 million a year in funding needs. We also prepared a laundry list of funding options for them to consider, such as raising the fuel tax, increasing vehicle registration fees, looking at some new mechanisms, whether it's bonding or tolling, a whole array of funding mechanisms. So the legislature did act and chose to modify primarily vehicle registration fees that we pay each year. And that provided the great majority of the funding increase. And we're extremely fortunate in Iowa that in this time we were able to work with the legislature and that they had the courage to take this action, because it's pretty rare in this atmosphere to want to look at increasing user fees, even when extremely warranted based on all of the analysis. But they did have the courage to do that. And based on our estimates, that would generate about $120 million in fiscal year 2012. It does grow over time because of some grandfathering provisions of registration fees. So primarily it impacts you when you buy a new vehicle, where you see the fee increase. As long as you have your current vehicle, you aren't seeing the increase primarily. 120 million is much less than the 267 million we need, but still very significant, and is actually putting Iowa in a better position than most states in the country in dealing with this crisis, which isn't an Iowa situation, it's a national situation. Just to look at the funding picture, what this chart shows, that orange bar across the top, that's the $267 million level we say we need to meet critical needs. The light blue bar is our estimates of Time 21 revenue growth over time. But what's interesting to see here is the ARRA funding. ARRA funding is that Recovery Act money. ARRA is the acronym for the bill, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. You can see the impact of that. It actually is going to be spent over 2 years, but you can see what that did in 2009 is it actually got us to the funding level we need to have every year. So it was really important to at least get us to that point in 2009. And then the iJobs money, that state stimulus, you can see how that has extended some of the benefits of the Recovery Act, so we don't drop off as much, which is important to the construction industry in the state. I'm going to move to transit and cover this pretty quickly. As I said, we have 35 transit agencies in the state. Iowa is relatively unique in the country in that all of our 99 counties have access to transit to some degree. Transit systems are distributed between those that provide rural service, large urban, small urban. In terms of ridership, 25.6 million rides were provided by public transit agencies in the state. And this may not be a surprise to you, but Iowa City, the 3 transit agencies that serve the Iowa City metro area provide the largest number of rides of any metro area. Almost 24% of all the rides in the state are in this metro area. So that exceeds Des Moines and every other metro area. Funding, just like on the highway side, we have the 3 legs of the stool: federal funding, state and local funding. Transit also did receive some Recovery Act funding, which was really important to help replace vehicles. Iowa's transit agencies are one of the oldest vehicle fleets in the country, so almost all of the 36 million went to buying new buses, replacing buses. So that was really important. In total, we have about $100 million per year in transit funding for Iowa's transit agencies. Following up on the relative success of looking at highway needs and working with the legislature to secure additional funding, a similar effort was begun a couple years ago looking at public transit needs. This is text from legislation that was passed directing the Iowa DOT to do a study of transit needs and revenues. But they got pretty specific in wanting us to look at both transit needs to meet the needs of Iowa's aging population, transportation dependent, but also looking at are there opportunities to increase transit usage to help meet our energy independence goals in the state. So that study was undertaken to answer those questions, look at demographics, our aging population, those that rely on transit because they're low income or aren't able to drive a car, try to assess that level of need versus the services being provided, and then also do an assessment of those that would use transit if transit was a more accessible service. If we had more frequent transit service, more access through additional transit routes, so people would be willing to take transit instead of take their vehicle or drive their car to work. If we could provide that additional service, how much would that cost? And then what would be the impact of that? Then, of course, identifying the cost of doing that. I think we all know we have an aging population in the States. That was a big piece of this analysis, is looking at our aging population and the public transit services that they may need in the future. To look at the choice side, those choice users that could choose to use transit instead of their passenger car. Well, one of the trends is that there's been little shift in mode usage over time. We do like our car, and we like to do our single occupant vehicle travel in this country. And so this was the big challenge, is can we make a difference in usage? Professor Fuller had a chart up there talking about increasing fuel costs and how that would be an impact in travel choice. And actually we saw that quite a bit when gas got to $4 a gallon. That made a difference in decisions, but can we make a difference when gas is back down to $2.50, $2.60 a gallon? So that was a challenge in this study. In looking at meeting the demand that exists out there, there is a demand for more service out there to serve those that rely on public transit. Of the 25.6 million ridership, about 54% of that level is additional demand. So we have a need for additional services for at least 10, 15 million rides a year. And this is a chart that tries to show that distribution of demand across the state and the different transit agencies. On the choice side, through an analysis of looking at increased frequency of transit service and increased routes, we did make an estimate through this analysis that we could increase the transit trips 24.3 million if we provided that additional service. That impact on annual VMT would be a reduction of 120 million miles traveled in the state. Now what's important here is to put that in perspective. We have about 31 billion miles traveled in Iowa a year. So this would result in about 0.4% reduction in vehicle miles of travel on our public road system. And of course it does have some benefits in fuel savings and emission reductions, but the challenging part of that is the cost to provide that service to get some more choice ridership is $350 million a year additional revenue. Again, we have about $100 million a year today. So a tremendous cost to not a lot of impact in ridership to meet that choice demand. Now again, as fuel prices rise, that has a bigger impact. So that's something we'll be watching. But to meet the baseline demand, that's meeting the demand that exists today for the transportation disadvantage. We need to basically double the revenue that is provided to transit agencies across the state. Okay, real quick here, I'm about out of time. On the funding uncertainty, and this really just follows up the presentation you heard, and Professor Hanley's comments will build on this, but we just met with, we have a transportation commission in Iowa that makes the programming decisions for the state highway system. They meet monthly, and we just met with them this week. We're talking about, they're working on the next 5-year program, a list of projects that they're going to be able to do in the next 5 years. And the comment was made that it's pretty depressing numbers when you look at the revenue available versus the needs that we're facing. This is complicated by the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty out there, a lot of it at the federal level. We rely on typically a 6-year transportation authorization bill to provide some certainty in federal funding for highways. That bill expired in end of September of 2009, and it's just been extended through little extensions in Congress, which actually resulted in the last week or two the Federal Highway Administration shutting down for a couple days because it wasn't extended. We were a couple days away from canceling our March letting of projects, and probably a week or two away of canceling contracts we've let in January, February. So this uncertainty has potential real impacts. The Highway Trust Fund, this is the trust fund for federal funding for highways. That hasn't been sustained, that isn't able to sustain the revenue that's flowing out. So there's been multiple transfers of general fund revenues. This is, again, is getting away from the user fee reliance. To get through the rest of this year, they're looking at a $20 billion transfer of general fund revenues to keep that solvent. And then fuel tax, again, as well, that you'll hear more about, is not sustainable in the long term. And then with these challenges, there's just a lot of political and public concern about raising user fees. Of course, we are in a recession, hopefully coming out of it now, so that adds to that concern. But even outside of a recession, there's just a real reluctance to increase fees to meet these needs. Climate change, there is going to be some federal action. It's looking less significant now than it was maybe even just a year ago, but there will be, before we're done, federal regulation of greenhouse gases. What that means, we're not quite sure about. So that'll have some impact on how we do our business. But beyond that, climate change is real, whether you believe it man-made has a role in it or not, and it's having an impact. We're going to see a narrowing of temperatures, which means more freeze-thaw cycles, which means all the potholes you're seeing now. Our commission had to do an amendment to our program this week, had $12 million to this year to do emergency repairs to the state system because of what's happened this winter. And then, of course, the flooding has impacts on infrastructure as well. And then last emerging issue, just because it's of an interest here in Iowa City, is with the Recovery Act. The Recovery Act provided $8 billion for passenger rail in this country. President Obama called that a down payment for regular sustained investment at the federal level for increasing passenger rail services in the state. The state of Iowa, we applied for some grants to provide service from Chicago to Dubuque and Chicago to the Quad Cities to Iowa City. Unfortunately, we weren't successful in securing that funding, but there already is a fiscal year 2010 appropriation of $2.5 billion for passenger rail, and we've been in discussions with the Federal Railroad Administration and feel our chances are very good at securing that funding. Now, that funding requires a 20% match. When the Recovery Act funding was 100% federal money, so now we just need to come up with state money to match that funding. But we think it is going to happen in the not too distant future, at least this initial service. What this map shows in red is existing Amtrak service. In blue is a really long-range vision for passenger rail service in the state. We want to walk into this very carefully. Passenger rail service will require state regular operational subsidies, so we don't want to jump into this full bore, but we feel the service from Chicago to Dubuque, Chicago to Iowa City will be really good test cases to see how successful it is in the public acceptance and using that service. And if we're successful, we hope to extend westward from that. I guess the last comment here on this slide is the legislature did appropriate $3 million in fiscal year 2010 for passenger rail, which was the first modern day appropriation for passenger rail in the state. And we're in discussions with the legislature this session to see if we can secure another appropriation to keep that momentum rolling. So with that, I'll pass it on to Paul Haney.